Hi, good evening. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan. Thank you for joining me. And today I'm taking on a complex topic, for me at least, because I'm not an obstetrician. I am more medical, and that's where my focus has been. But I'm able to look at physiology, analyze disease based on the trajectory of the pandemic, and try and make sense of some of the latest research. There's an important bit of information that is coming out with regards to the impact that mRNA vaccines and probably vaccines overall have on the ovaries. And so, what I'll be taking you through is the most recent paper here, and this was only published on the 26th of June 2024. And it's out of Israel, and this is really the focus of the talk. I'm going to be sharing as well some principles, some basic physiological principles, so that you have an idea as to how complex this system is. And it will help you to grasp what we are likely to face in the future, because that's what I'm interested in. Is many people are looking at this retrospectively, like this is just in the past. No, anything that has happened or we are finding now is likely to be relevant to future health of people. And in this case, it will be around the function of ovaries in the longer term in women. What are the longer term impacts? We would hope that they are minor and transient, but that should not be a hope. That should be a fact that is adequately investigated by the scientific community. So, this is primarily to update you as to what exactly is happening. Before we go any further, just to give you a little bit more updates, please remember in the link below in the description. Well, first, make sure you click on the subscribe button, which will be right here if you're on YouTube. But in the description, you should be able to see the link to be able to get to our newsletter, which is also giving away a free ebook. And we are giving away the Power of No, which is an ebook looking at how the sinuses work and sharing with you some ideas about that. But the critical thing we want you to do is join us in this journey and subscribe with us. So make sure you do that so that we can continue to keep you updated. Additionally, coming up in less than a week, as I'm working towards it, is the STORM, Spike Triggered Autoimmune Response Mechanism. This is going to be a webinar that I'm doing, which will eventually become a white paper looking at predicting what is going to happen next in terms of COVID. Part of it is that I, similar to Gert, anticipate their variants are going to continue to evolve. The question is, how will it present clinically? And that's what I'm trying to analyze. What are the clinical presentations that could occur? How could we identify it? And what critically can we do? So that's coming up. If you're interested, click on the link below. So let's get back to this question about an important paper that has come up recently. And you have to note that this paper, as I said, came out of Israel and it was published on the 26th of June. And essentially, what they were looking at is the direct effect of the vaccine, mRNA vaccine, on human ovarian granulosa cells, which could explain menstrual irregularities. So, we have to take you back to where this is coming from. And this is why I think we have to hold the line on the responsibility of regulators to do due diligence, because you may not have remembered this because time has flown in terms of the pandemic, but I will take you back to 2021. This is where this was an article produced by AP News looking at the fact that this is in June 2021. And I'm going to try and make this bigger so that you can see it. And so in June 2021, there was a claim that the COVID vaccines could make a spike protein, which is a toxin, and spread to other parts of the body and damage organs. And there was a radio interview with an Ontario professor, which was Professor Byron Bridle, And it was used, they said, to mislead social media users about COVID vaccines. So, in that radio interview, he was concerned. He said he was pro vax, but goes on to discuss a fringe theory that the spike protein produced from the vaccine is toxic and can damage certain organs. He was making specific reference to the ovaries, what they had seen in a Japanese study from mice. And though Bridle used the term we, there's no indication he was involved in any way in developing the vaccines. The spike protein is immunogenic. It produces an immune response, but it is not a toxin. This was another researcher who was countering it. And in effect, they went on. This was then Dr. Cole, an infectious disease expert, who went on to say that this was not relevant. And the post shared online from Bridle's interview to push the false narrative that COVID vaccines are dangerous and attack the body. Now, you can see where this was going because this was misinformation. He didn't lose his job at the time, but it was labeled as misinformation. You couldn't talk about it because it would produce vaccine hesitancy. And this was what happened at the time. But you have to remember that something else was also going on because at that time, women were complaining about menstrual irregularities. Now, this can happen with some vaccines. I think specifically, I think the hepatitis vaccine and the HPV vaccine can sometimes cause menstrual irregularities, but this was at a very significant scale, so much so that it needed to be studied. And this was a paper from Saudi Arabia at the time looking at COVID vaccination and menstrual disorders among women and a meta analysis. So, what it means is that they took multiple studies. So, there were lots of people looking at this across the world. Now, you can see from this here that when they looked through the results in terms of menorrhagia, increased bleeding, it was 24%. Polymenorrhea was 16%. And when they looked at abnormal cycle length, was about 6.6%, and oligomenorrhea, where there's no period, was 22%. This was significant across a lot of women. This was not a few. This was highly significant. It still worries me that women across the world were experiencing it and they weren't really raising the awareness from this. Should have been a major, almost Me Too issue, to be frank with you. It was so big, so many people were affected, yet it was going under the radar. And at that time, you have to remember there was a big push for the younger cohort to be vaccinated, and for they were moving into pregnancy as well. My concern was that you need to be able to explain the science of what is going on. You can't just say everything is fine and not actually know why. And they kept on hammering away at this. This was another paper that was produced in 2021, September 21. Exposure of ovaries to COVID vaccination does not impair fertility. They were looking within about a month of people being vaccinated. They're talking about the misinformation regarding COVID vaccination has contributed to vaccine hesitancy. This was what was going on, and there was not a thorough view as to what exactly was happening at the time. Now, let me remind people in case a lot of people forget. When we look at the characteristics of who was getting severe COVID 19, because that's what we're trying to stop, not necessarily somebody getting an infection. If you had a mild infection, I mean, you could get long COVID, but even then the percentages were much lower. The point was that in terms of severe disease, we were looking at older people with comorbidities. There tended to be a racial predilection, certainly in some countries, and obesity. And critically, men, 60% to 40%. That's really important point. So men were far more affected than women. So a healthy young woman like this one here was at exceptionally low risk of severe disease. So if you are seeing abnormal patterns around the menstrual cycle, that should make you a little bit more cautious, I think, with regards to that low risk cohort, because you don't know what the implications would be for the longer term. That's my view of it. So let's just take you through a little bit of the physiology and some of what was happening with the paper. So let's just take you back to basics. This here is a review of the, I guess, an ovarian review, I've put it. But you can see here, this is a woman. This is her uterus. The ovaries are here on both sides, and then you have the fallopian tube connecting it. And down here will be the vagina. Normally, a cell, the ovary would produce uh, I've gone blank for for a moment, but an egg that could be fertilized. It would go down the fallopian tube, depending on which side. And if there was an opportunity for it to become fertilized, it would then embed in the uterus here, and that's the onset of a pregnancy. And you have inside the ovary, so this is now the ovary cut through, you have the primordial follicles on the outside, and then a primary follicle. This one is not yet active, but more active as it goes from the cortex to the medulla. And then you have the more active here, secondary follicles. And these secondary follicles will aim to produce one activated follicle, which will then produce the egg, which then goes along. And if there is an opportunity for fertilization, that's what would happen. And that's the sequence that the body goes through each month. And it's a very, very complex and delicate procedure. And this is what it would look like from a physiological point of view. You can see here that this is the cycle, menstrual period, where somebody would be bleeding, the woman would be bleeding. And you can see the hormone levels here, follicle stimulating hormone in green, luteinizing hormone here in pinkish red. In blue is estrogen levels and progesterone here. So all of them working together help to cause this whole cycle to occur. So in the follicular phase, this is where the follicles are growing and getting prepared for an egg to be released. You can see that the estrogen here and the progesterone is remaining low. The estrogen is starting to rise to a peak. You have here then the luteinizing hormone does a surge along with the follicle stimulating hormone. That's the point that you have ovulation. That's right in the middle of the cycle. So it's about day 14 in a 28-day cycle. The egg is then released. It then goes down the fallopian tubes into the uterus. And at this point, the progesterone rises quite significantly. You have the estrogen levels coming down, and you have the luteinizing hormones and the follicular stimulating hormones going back to low and staying steady. And all of this is in preparation in case that egg that is released gets fertilized. And if it doesn't get fertilized, that's when you have shedding of the lining of the uterus. It goes through the same process again. This is what it would look like here. And again, you can see this is the menstrual, the part here. This represents when you have the bleeding. The lining of the uterus is stripped off. It starts again in the follicular phase. It starts to gradually increase the amount. The ovulation occurs here. It continues to increase because of progesterone. The egg doesn't get fertilized. Progesterone levels start to fall off. And then we go back to the shedding. And this is again a 28-day cycle. The importance of this is that it is such a complex, remarkable system. It is really well integrated. And I'm showing you again the hormonal changes. You can see how all four of these integrate to ensure that you have ovulation in the middle, because if without this occurring, the other bit doesn't really matter. So there's a very complex interrelationship between the hormones, the estrogen, the FSH, the LH, the progesterone, all working together in the context of this menstrual cycle. This is why I thought that the observation about the menstrual changes were so important. The menstrual cycle is probably the most sensitive physiological change that we can observe. Nothing else is as sensitive as the menstrual cycle. So, if that could be happening with the menstrual cycle in the ovaries and you're seeing changes, would it be happening to other organs as well? But because we are not aware of even subtle changes, we have no idea as to the implications of it. So let's get back to the paper here. Actually, before I get back to the paper, I wanted to mention something. In 2021, when they were making all the points were being raised and the safety, the CDC was aware that there was a question. And you'll notice here the VSD menstrual irregularities working group. At this point, this is January 27th, 2022, they were getting the reports. The reports are increasing, especially on social media platforms and vaccine adverse event reporting system. So they had realized that, you know what, we better investigate this. But the investigation only started in January. And at that point, they're still recommending the vaccine to the low risk female cohort who are in the prime where they are likely to have the benefit of these cycles. That is concerning because I would think that if they were concerned enough about this, you have a low risk cohort. Why would you mandate them to be vaccinated? This is the kind of question that we will still have to come back to legally. If there are long term issues, they better hope that everything goes away. I've highlighted a few things here about the paper, and they're in yellow here. As I said, this was a good paper. It's out of Israel, detailed look, and again, they're mentioning that women worldwide reported short-term menstrual irregularities. And so they were looking at it. One of the first things that you see here, preclinical examination of the vaccine polymeric envelope indicates its accumulation in the ovaries. So they knew this. And this was the point that Professor Bridle was making, and he was classed as being saying misinformation. What they found was that one of the hormones involved, inhibin B, was upregulated, while anti-Mullerian hormone was downregulated. And then when they looked at the post vaccination blood levels, they noticed a 2 to 3 fold change in the post vaccination period between the FSH and inhibin B levels, protein level ratio. Inhibin B acts to inhibit the follicle stimulating hormone at the level of the anterior pituitary, so up in the brain. So the levels and the ratio of this are likely to be very important with regards to how that cycle that I was showing you works together. So really important information. The final point they made here in the abstract that I'll mention here is that the altered expression of inhibin B could significantly impact this axis, hypothalamic pituitary axis, in vaccinated women, and may ultimately influence their endometrium cyclicity manifested clinically by the commonly reported changes in menstrual bleeding patterns. One of the problems is that they are still looking at this in a relatively short period of time, and the longer term implications are not yet fully known. So I'm going to highlight an important part of this in terms of the uterus and how it works. So I'm going to show you this here. So again, the selection of the dominant follicle. This is what happens again every cycle. They have a number of secondary follicles, all of them capable of producing an egg. One of them gets selected, sometimes two, which is where you can have twins or they split. But one of them gets selected. That one would then go on to produce the egg, which can then get fertilized. Now, what we have here is that when we look at anti-Mullerian hormone and you look at these here, the primordial follicles and the primary follicles, which are more peripheral, which eventually will become secondary follicles, What you have to realize is that this hormone, one, the levels tend to be stable. It doesn't fluctuate as much as the other ones. It is a marker for ovarian reserve. That means it tends to give you an indication as how many of these follicles are left before a woman would go into menopause in her like late 40s or in her 50s. As I said, it indicates the number of primary follicles left, and it has an impact on the follicle stimulating hormone level. What we don't know is why this is down regulated. And to make it clear, so just so that you are clear, I'll show you again. I've highlighted it here. Inhibin B is upregulated, whereas AMH, anti-Müllerian hormone, was downregulated. This doesn't really make sense unless there is damage to follicles. That means that follicles outside of the ones that are involved directly in the menstrual cycle, the secondary follicles, clearly must have been affected because this is normally relatively stable. So, has it led to longer term damage to the number of follicles? This is where we'll not know the outcomes of this for another 10 or 15 years. When you look at longer term fertility, when you look at menopause, women won't know this 20 years down the line if they have early menopause in relation to we have so many questions that need to be answered that are absolutely critical. Here's another bit that I think is important. When they exposed the cells and they got these granulosa cells, exposed them to what they thought would be the level of vaccine after injection versus end organ levels, one of the things that they were noticing was that interleukin 8, and you can see it here, IL-8. Now, this is a cytokine, an inflammatory cytokine. And so this is when they have the control after injection end organ dose. What you can see here is that the IL-8 goes up significantly. Now, my feeling is that the only thing that can explain all of this is an inflammatory process. In my view, it's autoimmune. And that's what I've been looking at. Autoimmune, in that if you have spike protein being produced in these cells, you should have the immune system responding to it, either antibody or cytotoxic T cells, targeting these cells to destroy them. But what happens if this occurs in primary follicles, as I had shown you before, where you have a situation, and again, I'll show you this here. What happens if it's occurring and damaging these here? Because these represent the future follicles that would be coming along in time. Suppose a significant proportion of these are damaged. What does that mean longer term? And these are the kinds of questions that we really need to understand. We really need to grasp. And in terms of interleukin 8, if interleukin 8 is an inflammatory process, the kinds of things that are associated with elevated levels of interleukin 8 are things like endometriosis, polycystic ovarian syndrome, pelvic inflammatory disease. This is usually infection, ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, down the line, ovarian cancer. Now, we have to clarify if this is only transient or if this remains a longer term issue. But inflammation clearly is a big part of what could be explaining all of these characteristics that we're seeing. Menstrual irregularities in some studies were almost 44%. And women would know this because if that's the case, you're talking about 1 in 2 to 1 in 3 women would have had a change in terms of their cycle, either increased bleeding, longer length, no bleeding after they have been vaccinated. How many are certain women more at risk if they have already had issues? These are huge questions going forward. My thought on it is that when we pull back from this, there was a very big push, and I think they just don't want to acknowledge that they didn't know that the the thought they had with regards to the fact that the vaccine impacted on severity of disease. Some people will argue about that. It does wane relatively quickly, but they thought it would have blocked transmission and they would have been able to get over the pandemic quickly. I think this was a combination of types of greed, political and financial. They saw an opportunity to either make a lot of money and, from a political point of view, become the next Winston Churchill at stopping the pandemic in their country. I think that that temptation was such a big draw that people stepped aside from caution, which is what we normally do in these circumstances. I would still have argued that you could vaccinate people who are high risk and people who had not previously been infected. I can't understand the logic because in no other disease, if somebody has had an infection, if you had chickenpox, if you had measles, you have natural immunity. It's only around COVID that natural immunity was questioned and derided. It's not that people couldn't get another infection, but if you had natural immunity and no interferon autoantibodies, the risk of severe disease, I'm not talking about an infection, the risk of severe disease was extremely low, which is what we were trying to block. We were supposed to be blocking the ICUs getting full. Instead, I think we are now going to the point as to exposing the implications long term of what has happened around the pandemic and where the responsibilities lie. One of them, sadly, is the fact that what seems to be called misinformation early in the pandemic technically means that they haven't done the adequate studies and it doesn't fit the narrative. That is not acceptable. And therefore, we need to go back to basics because public trust is at risk here. I think that more people should be talking about this. Is such an important topic. Definitely want obstetricians and critically people who are in the fertility industry. What are the outcomes? Are they seeing any differences between vaccinated and unvaccinated women? Are they seeing a drop off in terms of what happens with IVF with some of these hormonal changes? Is it harder to harvest the eggs? That information will be out there. The answers will be out there. The question is, why are the people who know this not speaking about this, not educating, not sharing the information, simply because everybody's afraid of getting caught in terms of the narrative? These are challenging times, but we need to be brave, and critically, everyone needs to be advocating for patients, making sure we're doing everything in our power to protect our patients longer term from disease and illness. So, as a final point, please remember, join our newsletter. You'll get lots of information there. The link is below, and you'll also get a Power of No ebook for you to be able to read, and we'll be able to share with you more things. And if you are interested in our upcoming storm, this storm here, this is very important as we continue to get variants. I am trying to step ahead of it to predict what's going to happen next. What I consider the spike triggered autoimmune response mechanism. Serious challenges ahead. Join me at the webinar next week if you want to learn more. Have a great evening.